The silver ship hung above Earth like a judgment waiting to be passed. Inside its sterile command deck, Captain Vex of the Korvax Empire studied the blue planet below. His species had conquered 1,000 worlds, each falling within days of their arrival. Earth would be no different. "Commander Zara," Vex said through his telepathic link, his forearms moving across the control panel. "Begin the mind scan. Select a random human specimen." The Korvax had evolved beyond physical warfare. Their greatest weapon was the ability to read minds, to understand their enemies completely before striking. Know your enemy's fears, and victory was certain. This technique had never failed them. Zara's tentacle-like appendages danced across the scanning array. "Target acquired, Captain. A human male, designation ... John Smith. He appears to be sitting in what they call a park, consuming a sandwich." Vex's 3 eyes narrowed with amusement. "Perfect. A civilian mind will be simple to break. Their military secrets, their weaknesses, all will be exposed through this one pathetic creature." The mind-reading chamber hummed to life. Vex positioned himself in the center, allowing the neural connectors to attach to his cranium. He had done this countless times before. Primitive species always thought the same things: fear of death, concern for offspring, basic survival instincts. Humans would be no different. "Initiating connection," Zara announced. The moment Vex entered John's mind, something felt wrong. Instead of the usual linear thought patterns he expected, he encountered something else entirely. It was like stepping into a storm made of contradictions. John was simultaneously thinking about his sandwich. Turkey, too much mustard, the quarterly report due Monday, whether his wife would like roses or lily for their anniversary, the plot of a movie he'd seen 15 years ago, anxiety about climate change, excitement about a video game releasing next month, and somehow conducting an imaginary argument with his high school math teacher about a test grade from 20 years ago. Vex tried to focus, to find the thread of military knowledge or societal weakness. But John's mind jumped again. Now he was imagining himself as a pirate captain, then wondering if aliens existed. The irony was not lost on Vex. Then calculating if he had enough gas to get home, while simultaneously humming a song that seemed to have no actual melody. "Captain, your vital signs are elevated," Zara's voice echoed distantly. Vex pushed deeper. Surely beneath this chaos lay something organized, something that made sense. But the deeper he went, the worse it became. John was now thinking about death, but not with fear, with a strange, almost casual acceptance. He contemplated his mortality while also planning what to have for dinner. The human was simultaneously aware of his cosmic insignificance and convinced he was the main character of reality. He felt crushing despair about his existence and explosive joy about seeing a dog. Earlier that day, then Vex found the memories of human history. Wars that killed millions fought over ideas, borders that existed only in their minds, resources they didn't truly need. They had weapons that could destroy their own planet several times over, and they kept making more. They knew they were destroying their only home, and they continued anyway. But what truly made Vex recoil was what came next. Despite all this, despite knowing their flaws, their mortality, their insignificance, humans just ... continued. They fell in love, made art, told jokes while their world burned. They created beauty in the midst of chaos. They hoped without reason. They fought against impossible odds, not because they could win, but because they decided it was right. John's mind shifted again. He was now thinking about sacrifice, not the concept, but a memory. A news story about a stranger who died saving a child from drowning. The child was unknown to them. There was no logical reason. The human had simply decided another's life was worth more than their own. In a split second, without thinking, this wasn't courage. This was something else. This was insanity weaponized into virtue. Vex tried to pull back, but found himself trapped deeper in John's consciousness. The human mind wasn't just chaotic, it was contradictory in ways that defied physics. John simultaneously believed in science and carried a lucky coin. He understood that he was a collection of atoms in an indifferent universe, yet he acted as if his choices had cosmic significance. The alien captain encountered John's knowledge of human entertainment. Stories where humans fought gods and won. Stories where they traveled through time to save loved ones, breaking reality itself for emotional reasons. Stories where they bonded with their enemies, turning foes into friends through sheer stubborn kindness. And the most terrifying part? Humans found these stories inspirational rather than cautionary. Vex discovered something called memes, ideas that spread like viruses through human consciousness, mutating and evolving. Humans would die for memes. They would kill for them. Democracy, freedom, justice, concepts that had no physical form, yet humans treated them as more real than the ground beneath their feet. Then came the humor. John's mind flickered to something called dark humor, humans joking about their own extinction, making comedy from tragedy. They laughed at death. They made jokes while in danger. During their greatest disasters, someone somewhere was making a pun. This wasn't denial. They fully understood the horror, and they laughed anyway. Vex found memories of human sports. They created artificial conflicts, fake wars with arbitrary rules, and became emotionally invested in the outcomes. They would weep over a game while actual wars raged. They could ignore real problems while obsessing over fictional ones. Yet somehow, this made them more unpredictable. Not less. The alien's consciousness brushed against John's creativity center. Here was true madness. Humans created art that served no evolutionary purpose. They made music that consisted of silence. They painted canvases one solid color and called it profound. They wrote poetry that didn't rhyme, stories that didn't end, and songs about nothing. And other humans found meaning in this meaninglessness. John's mind wandered to love. Not the biological imperative to reproduce, but something far more dangerous. Humans loved ideas, places, objects, fictional characters, and people who had been dead for centuries. They loved things that could never love them back. They wrote millions of songs about love, each claiming to describe something indescribable, and kept writing more. Vex encountered the concept of hope. It was like staring into an abyss that stared back with a smile. Humans hoped against evidence, against logic, against their own experiences. They hoped while dying. They hoped for impossible things. And most terrifying of all, sometimes their hope made the impossible happen. They changed reality through sheer stubborn refusal to accept it. The captain tried to find something stable, some foundation of human thought to exploit. He found their science, their mathematics. Surely here was logic. But no. Humans had discovered quantum mechanics, learned that reality itself was uncertain. That observation changed outcomes, that particles could be in two places at once. And instead of going mad from this knowledge, they just accepted it and kept going. They built technologies based on uncertainty principles. They gambled with the fundamental nature of existence and called it progress. John's thoughts shifted to death again, but differently. Humans knew everyone they loved would die. They knew they would die. They knew their species would eventually end. Their planet would be consumed by their sun. The universe itself would experience heat death. They had calculated their own expiration date as a species, as a planet, as a universe. And what did they do with this knowledge? They made plans for tomorrow. They started long-term projects they couldn't possibly finish. They had children, knowing those children would suffer and die. They loved people harder, knowing loss was inevitable. Captain Vex. Zara's voice was urgent now. You must disconnect. Your neural patterns are destabilizing. But Vex couldn't pull away. He was seeing something impossible. Humans had evolved not despite their madness, but because of it. Their irrationality was their strength. Their chaos was their weapon. They could believe 6 impossible things before breakfast and use that as motivation to attempt a 7th. John finished his sandwich and stood up, completely unaware that an alien consciousness was reeling inside his mind. He was now thinking about getting ice cream, while also contemplating the heat death of the universe, while also wondering if his wife would prefer chocolate or vanilla, while also imagining himself as a dragon, while also worried about his mortgage payment. This wasn't a mind that could be conquered. This was a mind that had already conquered itself 1,000 times over and decided to keep fighting anyway. Asterisk. Desperate to understand, Vex dove into humanity's military history, searching for some pattern, some weakness in their approach to conflict. What he found defied all logic of warfare his species had developed over millennia. Humans glorified last stands. They celebrated defeats. A place called Thermopylae, where 300 warriors died knowing they would die, became more inspiring to humans than any victory. They built monuments to their losses. They told stories of defeats for thousands of years, and somehow this made them stronger. John's mind contained fragments of military knowledge absorbed from movies, books, and random conversations. Vex saw human soldiers throwing themselves on grenades to save comrades. Pilots crashing their planes into enemies when out of ammunition. Soldiers fighting with broken bodies, missing limbs, continuing when any rational being would surrender. And the most insane part? These weren't rare occurrences. Every human conflict had hundreds of such stories. The alien discovered something called the Geneva Convention, rules humans had created for war. They actually tried to regulate how they killed each other, as if adding arbitrary restrictions to violence somehow made it civilized. They banned certain weapons for being too cruel, while keeping others that killed just as effectively. They protected medics and prisoners, showing mercy to enemies who would have killed them moments before. It was madness pretending to be order, but then Vex found something that made his 3 hearts skip in unison. Humans had developed weapons that could crack planets, dissolve matter at the subatomic level, and create black holes. They had the technology to become gods of destruction. And what did they do? They mostly didn't use them. They kept these apocalyptic tools locked away, arguing endlessly about the ethics of weapons that could end everything. They had the power to destroy, and chose not to, not from weakness, but from a strange strength that came from restraint. John's wandering thoughts touched on something called mutually assured destruction. Humans had pointed world-ending weapons at each other for decades, each side capable of ending all life on Earth, and somehow this created peace. They turned the promise of annihilation into a stabilizing force. They made insanity into strategy. The captain found memories of human veterans, warriors who had seen horrors beyond description, who carried wounds both physical and mental, yet they returned home and became teachers, healers, builders. They transformed from destroyers to creators, sometimes in the span of days. They could hold their children with the same hands that had ended lives. This ability to switch between extremes, to contain such contradictions, was terrifying. Vex discovered human military training. They deliberately broke down their soldiers' minds and rebuilt them. They used pain, exhaustion, and psychological pressure to forge warriors. But the goal wasn't to remove humanity, it was to concentrate it. To make soldiers who could kill when necessary, but remain human, remain capable of compassion. They mass-produced warriors who could cry over a fallen enemy. Through John's scattered knowledge, Vex learned about human irregulars, civilians who became fighters when threatened, farmers who became snipers, teachers who became guerrilla leaders, children who became spies. When pushed, Any human could become a warrior. Their entire species was a sleeping army that awakened when threatened. They didn't need to be bred for war. They could choose it in an instant and choose peace just as quickly. The alien's mind reeled at human military doctrine. They had something called acceptable losses. They calculated how many of their own they were willing to sacrifice for objectives. They planned for their own deaths. They had contingencies for if they lost. They studied their defeats more than their victories, learning from failure with an obsession that bordered on worship. John's mind flickered to video games, simulations of war that humans played for fun. They practiced genocide against fictional aliens for entertainment. Children played at war, training their minds for conflict while laughing. They made war into art, into stories, into games. They were so comfortable with violence that they made it recreational. But what truly made Vex's consciousness shudder was discovering human resilience. Cities that were completely destroyed were rebuilt in years. Populations that faced genocide recovered and thrived. Humans who lost everything started over, again and again. They treated catastrophe as an inconvenience, apocalypse as a setback. They had a saying, "That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger." They literally believed suffering improved them. The captain tried to find fear, the universal weakness of all sentient beings. But humans feared strange things. They feared being forgotten more than death. They feared being wrong more than being hurt. They feared hurting others more than being hurt themselves. Their fears made them more dangerous, not less. Vex's consciousness, now trembling with exhaustion, encountered the part of John's mind dedicated to human imagination and creativity. It was like falling into a supernova made of possibilities. Humans didn't just dream when they slept. They daydreamed while awake, creating entire universes in their minds while performing mundane tasks. John was currently operating in 3 realities simultaneously. The physical world where he walked through the park, a fantasy where he was negotiating a business deal that would make him rich, and another where he was having a conversation with his deceased grandfather. The alien found humanity's relationship with fiction. They knew stories weren't real, yet they cried over fictional deaths, felt real anger at fictional villains, and formed deep emotional bonds with characters that never existed. They would argue passionately about the decisions of imaginary people. They created fan fiction, stories about stories, dreams within dreams, infinitely recursive creativity that served no purpose except to create more. John's mind held memories of human art galleries. Humans would stare at arrangements of color on canvas and claim to see meaning. They would listen to organized sound waves and claim to feel emotions. They would watch other humans pretend to be different humans on stages and screens, and somehow this pretending revealed truths. They paid millions for paintings, billions for entertainment, dedicating vast resources to things that had no practical value. The captain discovered human music. They had created millions of songs about the same few topics: love, loss, joy, pain, and yet each one claimed to be unique. They combined mathematics and emotion into sound waves that could make them cry or dance or fight. They used music as weapon, comfort, identity, and rebellion. Some humans couldn't live without music, choosing death over silence. Vex found humanity's obsession with stories. Every human culture had myths, legends, tales passed down through generations. They used the stories to teach, to warn, to inspire, to remember. They believed in the power of narrative so strongly that they would reshape their entire lives to fit a story they wanted to tell about themselves. They were simultaneously the authors, actors, and audience of their own existence. The alien consciousness brushed against John's knowledge of human innovation. They invented things they didn't need. They solved problems that didn't exist. They created artificial intelligence while not fully understanding their own intelligence. They were trying to create consciousness in machines while debating whether consciousness existed at all. They were attempting to become gods before figuring out how to be human. John's wandering thoughts revealed human architecture. They built structures that defied necessity. Towers that scraped the sky for no reason except to prove they could. Bridges that were art as much as infrastructure. Buildings designed to make people feel emotions. They turned shelter, a basic survival need, into expression of identity, culture, and dreams. The captain found memories of human cuisine. They had turned eating, another survival necessity, into an art form. They combined flavors that shouldn't work, but did. They spent hours preparing food that would be consumed in minutes. They had competitions about cooking, shows about watching people cook, and people who were famous for eating. They had taken sustenance and transformed it into culture. Asterisk. Vex discovered something called fashion. Humans decorated themselves for no survival advantage. They wore uncomfortable clothes because they looked good. They pierced their skin, marked their bodies, changed their appearance constantly. They expressed identity through fabric and color. They judged each other by coverings that served no practical purpose. They had turned protection from elements into a form of communication. Through John's scattered knowledge, the alien learned about human sports and games. They had created thousands of ways to compete without killing each other. They invested emotional energy in arbitrary rules and meaningless outcomes. They formed deep tribal bonds over which group of humans could move a ball most effectively. They turned everything into a competition, eating, sleeping, doing nothing. They competed over who could compete the best. The most disturbing discovery was human education. They taught their young to question everything, including what they were taught. They encouraged rebellion in their offspring. They filled children's minds with stories of heroes who defied authority, broke rules, and changed the world. They were literally training their replacements to overthrow them, and they called this progress. John's mind wandered to the internet, humanity's collective consciousness made manifest. They had created a network where all human knowledge, stupidity, creativity, and chaos mixed together. They had given every human access to all information and misinformation simultaneously. They had democratized truth and lies, making reality a matter of opinion. And somehow, their society hadn't collapsed. It had accelerated. Asterisk as Vex's consciousness began to fracture under the weight of human contradictions. He made one last desperate attempt to find something, anything that made sense. He dove into the deepest part of John's mind, the core of what made him human. What he found there broke him completely. At the center of John's being was not fear, not survival instinct, not even love. It was something far more terrifying, acceptance of absurdity. John knew life was meaningless, and he had decided to give it meaning anyway. He knew he was insignificant, and he had chosen to matter anyway. He knew everything ended, and he had decided to begin anyway. This wasn't ignorance. This was defiance of reality itself. Humans had looked into the void, understood their cosmic insignificance, calculated their own extinction, mapped their own flaws, documented their own failures, and they had responded with a collective shrug and decision to keep going. They had turned existential horror into motivation. They had weaponized hope against entropy itself. Vex saw humanity's future through John's imagination. They dreamed of spreading across the galaxy, not to conquer, but to explore. They wanted to meet other species, not to dominate them, but to learn from them, to befriend them, to add their stories to humanity's infinite collection. They imagined wars and peace with equal enthusiasm. They prepared for both with equal intensity. The alien captain realized with dawning horror that humans couldn't be conquered because they had already conquered themselves every morning when they chose to get out of bed. Each human fought a constant internal war between despair and hope. Chaos and order, animal and angel, and they had learned to harness that conflict as fuel. They were billions of individuals who somehow formed societies. They were mortals who planned for eternity. They were animals who aspired to godhood. They were gods who chose to remain human. They were walking paradoxes that had turned contradiction into a survival strategy. "Disconnect me." Vex screamed through the neural link, his alien mind finally breaking under the pressure of trying to contain human consciousness. Zara frantically worked the controls, severing the connection. Vex collapsed in the mind-reading chamber, his 3 eyes wide with terror, his 4 arms trembling uncontrollably. "Captain, what did you see?" Zara asked, concerned. Vex struggled to form words. How could he explain that he had encountered a species that had evolved past the need for sanity? How could he describe beings that had turned madness into method, chaos into strength, absurdity into purpose? "We cannot conquer them," Vex whispered, his voice hollow. "They have already done worse to themselves than we could ever imagine, and they called it growth. They have faced existential horror and made it into entertainment. They have stared into the abyss so long that the abyss blinked first." "Surely they're military," Zara began. "Their military is the least of our concerns," Vex interrupted. "Every human is a potential warrior, artist, philosopher, and madman combined. They don't just adapt to suffering. They seek it out, create it, share it, and somehow transform it into strength. They are a species that plays with apocalypse for fun." The captain stood shakily, moving to the observation window to look at Earth below. "Send the order to the fleet. We're leaving. Mark this system as quarantined. No contact, ever. Sir, the Empire will demand an explanation. Tell them," Vex said, his voice gaining strength, "tell them we found a species that has infected reality itself with their consciousness. They have broken the universe's rules simply by existing. They are entropy and order simultaneously. They are death that chooses life. They are finite beings who behave as if they're infinite." He turned to his crew, his expression grave. "Humans don't need to defeat us in battle. The mere knowledge that they exist, that such beings are possible, is enough to drive any rational species to madness. They have turned insanity into evolution. They have made chaos into culture. As the Korvax fleet powered up their engines to leave Earth's system forever, Vex had one final thought that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Humans knew aliens might exist, and instead of fearing them, they had already created thousands of stories about befriending them, marrying them, and inviting them to dinner. Below on Earth, John finished his walk in the park, completely unaware that he had just saved his entire species. He was thinking about what to watch on TV that night, while also wondering about the meaning of life, while also trying to remember if he had fed his cat. The universe's most dangerous species went about their day, beautifully, terrifyingly, impossibly human. Asterisk.